picture this. You sit down at your desk, your coffee is perfectly hot, your intentions are incredibly pure.
Oh, I know this feeling well.
Right. You are going to conquer that massive, intimidating project you've been putting off for weeks. So you open your laptop, you crack your knuckles, and then your smartphone buzzes.
Just one little buzz.
Exactly. And you think, I'll just check it for a second. But then you notice an unread email that seems urgent.
Which it never actually is.
Never. But a few clicks later, you've somehow opened 3 new browser tabs, you're reading about something entirely unrelated to your job, and boom, a half hour has just evaporated into thin air.
It's just gone.
Yeah. Instead of feeling productive, you're sitting there feeling utterly frustrated and already behind.
It is a profoundly universal experience. I mean, so many of us internalize that specific scenario as a personal failure.
Oh, totally. We blame ourselves.
Right. We assume we simply lack discipline or willpower, when the reality is, well, much more systemic.
We absolutely do. But today, we're taking a deep dive into a stack of source material that fundamentally changes how we look at that exact problem. Because the reality is, our attention is constantly fragmented for a reason.
Yeah, we were walking around with powerful computers in our pockets.
Exactly. Our brains are subjected to this continuous, relentless stimulation from algorithms.
Yeah.
And those are designed by, thousands of engineers just to hijack our focus.
And frankly, our monkey brains simply did not evolve to handle this.
Not at all. So, the mission for this deep dive is to explore a comprehensive guide on a time management method you might have heard of. It's the Pomodoro Technique.
A classic.
Yeah. We're going to look at the fascinating neuroscience behind why it actually works, how it prevents burnout, and how you can adapt it to build a sustainable relationship with your work.
Which is vital context to establish right away, I think, because modern society falsely equates long hours and endless multitasking with high productivity.
Oh, we totally celebrate the hustle.
Right. We admire people who skip lunch breaks and just, grind through 12-hour shifts. But true productivity is about working with your brain's natural biology instead of constantly fighting a losing battle against it.
And since this modern digital age basically created this crisis of constant distraction, I find it, hilarious that the solution we are looking at dates back to the very low-tech era of the 1980s.
Yes, the 80s. It's a great story.
It really is. So the Pomodoro Technique started with a guy named Francesco Cirillo. He was this overwhelmed Italian university student who was struggling with severe procrastination.
Like a lot of students.
Exactly. He was finding it impossible to concentrate and feeling completely buried by his reading assignments.
And that paralysis of having too much to do, that's exactly what triggers the distraction cycle you described earlier.
Right, because it's too much to process. So Francesco issues himself a challenge. He wondered, could he just sit down and give his undivided attention to one single task for exactly 25 minutes?
Just 25 minutes.
Yeah. And to track the time, he grabbed what he had sitting in his kitchen, which happened to be this little mechanical timer shaped like a tomato.
And the Italian word for tomato is Pomodoro.
Exactly. And that little plastic kitchen timer eventually became a global productivity framework.
It's amazing. And the mechanics he built around that timer, they're really straightforward.
Yeah, walk us through it.
So you define one discrete task. You set a timer for 25 minutes. And during that window, you give the task your complete attention.
No checking emails.
No emails, no social media, no switching to a different project, none of that.
Right.
Then, when the bell rings, you stop and take a 5-minute walk. And after you complete 4 of these 25-minute sessions, which are called 4 Pomodoros, you take a longer break of 15 to 30 minutes.
Now, there's a detail in the sources regarding the mechanics that I find really clever.
Oh, about the distractions.
Yeah. If a distracting thought pops into your head during those 25 minutes, like say you suddenly remember you need to pay a utility bill, you don't ignore it.
Because if you ignore it, it'll just keep bothering you.
Exactly. It's just going to rattle around in there. But you also don't act on it. You just write it down on a piece of scratch paper, get it out of your working memory, and gently return your attention to the task.
That physical act of writing the distraction down acts as a release valve.
Right.
It acknowledges the thought without actually breaking your current cognitive focus.
Okay, let's unpack this a little bit, because looking at the scale of the modern distraction problem, setting a plastic tomato on a desk to cure a dopamine addiction seems, totally mismatched.
It sounds too simple.
Yeah. How is a simple countdown clock supposed to counteract the entire internet?
What's fascinating here is that the timer itself isn't the active ingredient.
Okay, then what is?
The timer is a mechanism that creates cognitive boundaries.
Mm.
Psychologically speaking, when you look at a massive multi-day project, your brain naturally fixates on the enormous scale of the challenge.
Oh, for sure. It feels like climbing Everest.
Right. And that scale triggers anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And what does the brain do? It naturally seeks to escape anxiety by finding a quick dopamine hit.
Like checking your phone.
Exactly. But the timer psychologically shrinks that intimidating mountain into a highly achievable 25-minute hill.
A 25-minute hill. I like that.
It lowers the barrier to entry so drastically that your brain doesn't feel the need to escape anymore.
It changes the internal question from how am I going to finish this massive report to just what can I do on this report in the next 25 minutes?
Exactly. It makes it manageable.
That makes a lot of sense. But that brings us to the science, which is where these sources get really dense.
They really do dive deep.
Yeah. So if the magic isn't the timer, why does that specific 25-minute chunk work so universally well across different fields and different types of people?
The answer they provide is entirely rooted in human biology.
Right.
It challenges a deeply flawed metaphor in our culture. We tend to talk about attention as if it were a light switch.
Right, like you just flip it on.
Exactly. We assume we are either perfectly focused or we are hopelessly distracted. But neuroscience shows us that attention does not work like a switch. It's a biological resource that depletes and replenishes.
The sources describe human attention much more like a wave.
A wave is a perfect analogy.
You have to ride the crest when it peaks and then let the water pull back when the energy dissipates.
Yes. And if we connect this to the bigger picture of human biology, we operate on what are called ultradian rhythms.
Okay, so most people know about circadian rhythms, right? Like our 24-hour sleep-wake cycle.
Right. But ultradian rhythms are shorter biological cycles that occur throughout our waking day. Roughly every 90 to 120 minutes, our alertness, our ability to solve problems, and our concentration, they naturally rise to a peak.
And then they biologically fade.
Exactly. They fade.
And the sources emphasize that the brain, while obviously an organ, it behaves very much like a muscle in this regard.
It really does. Every single decision you make, every paragraph you read, every problem you solve, it literally consumes physical metabolic energy in the brain.
So glucose is actually being burned.
Exactly. Glucose is being burned. And when we ignore that biological reality and try to just push through the fatigue, we are essentially trying to sprint on a pulled muscle.
Oh, that sounds painful.
It is. You start making strange errors, or, you experience that phenomenon where you read the exact same sentence 4 times in a row.
And you absorb absolutely nothing. I am so guilty of that.
We all are. Your brain is signaling that the ultradian rhythm is dropping into its recovery phase, and you are trying to force it to stay in the high-performance phase.
So when you force your brain to keep working past its natural capacity, you are burning vast amounts of energy while accomplishing significantly less.
Precisely.
But the part of the research I found most surprising was about the 5-minute break itself. During that pause, your brain doesn't just, go to sleep.
Not at all. It actually switches into a completely different, highly active network. When you are focusing on a task, you are using the brain's task positive network. But when you step away, get a glass of water, or look out the window, your brain switches to the default mode network.
And this is where the actual learning happens, right?
Yes, exactly. While your conscious mind is resting, that default mode network is working furiously in the background.
Wow.
It is taking the new information you just consumed, strengthening the neural pathways, organizing the knowledge, and making unexpected creative connections with older memories.
The analogy I kept thinking of while reading this was a computer's RAM.
Oh, that's a good one.
Like, if you keep opening complex programs and demanding immediate processing, eventually the system just freezes.
Right.
The 5-minute break is like letting the computer finally compile the code in the background and clear the working memory. You are actually preserving the machine.
That is a brilliant way to put it.
It explains why the most brilliant ideas never seem to happen when you are, white-knuckling it at your desk, staring at a blinking cursor.
Nope. They happen when you step in the shower or when you are walking the dog.
Exactly. The brain finally has the space to run that background process.
So strategic rest doesn't diminish your output. It is a fundamental requirement of it. It preserves your ability to make good decisions and keeps your cognitive load manageable.
Okay, so if the biology dictates so clearly that we need to rest and that our brains literally require these pauses to consolidate information, why do we constantly push ourselves to the absolute brink of exhaustion in our modern workplaces?
Because we exist in an environment that relentlessly celebrates the visible struggle.
So true.
We are bombarded with messaging that equates human worth with nonstop effort. There is a pervasive, unspoken rule in many corporate cultures that the person answering emails at midnight is the most dedicated and valuable employee.
Yeah, the whole hustle culture thing.
Exactly. But the sources explicitly define burnout not as an excess of work, but as the inevitable physiological result of long periods of effort combined with an absence of recovery.
So burnout isn't just working too much, it's resting too little.
Right.
That completely reframes the issue.
Huh.
But here's where it gets really interesting. I do want to challenge the rigid structure of the timer for a moment.
Okay, go for it.
Let's say I'm writing, and I am deeply in the zone. You know that feeling?
Oh, absolutely. The flow state.
Yeah. The words are flowing perfectly, the ideas are connecting, and suddenly, ring, that little tomato bell goes off. Stopping after 25 minutes feels like I am intentionally sabotaging my own momentum.
This raises an important question, and it's the most common resistance people have when adopting the method.
I bet.
People always ask, why break a winning streak?
Right. Why break it?
Well, to understand this, we have to reframe what the break is actually doing. Taking that rest doesn't interrupt the work. It completes the cycle of work.
But if I feel totally fine, why stop?
Because cognitive fatigue is cumulative.
Yeah.
By the time you consciously feel exhausted, you have already depleted your reserves.
Oh, wow.
Think of it like a marathon runner. They don't wait until they are entirely dehydrated to take a sip of water, do they?
No, they have hydration stations everywhere.
Right. They hydrate at regular stations to maintain their baseline.
Yeah.
So if you push that flow state for 3 straight hours without a break, you might get a lot done in that specific window.
But at what cost?
Exactly. Your cognitive load becomes so heavy that you are essentially borrowing energy from tomorrow.
Ouch.
You will likely spend the next 2 days feeling entirely depleted and unable to focus. Stopping when the bell rings, even if you feel you could keep going, prevents that stress from quietly accumulating.
So you are choosing sustainable performance over an occasional massive burst of depleting effort.
Yes.
The Pomodoro Technique is basically sending a physiological message to your nervous system that says, hey, it is safe to pause. We do not have to run at maximum capacity forever.
Precisely. You protect your baseline energy so you can show up again the next day and the day after that.
Understanding the underlying neuroscience of why breaks are necessary is one thing. But actually implementing them correctly in our messy, chaotic daily lives is another entirely.
Oh, it's definitely a challenge.
The sources dedicate a lot of time to the major pitfalls because people try this technique, they get the biology wrong, and then they just declare that the Pomodoro method doesn't work for them.
Yeah, I see that all the time. The first and arguably the most destructive mistake relates directly to what we choose to do during those 5-minute breaks.
Okay, I have a feeling I know what this is.
Mistake number 1 is the screen time break.
Oh man, I am extremely guilty of this.
Most people are.
The timer goes off, I feel a quick sense of accomplishment, and my immediate instinct is to pick up my phone and scroll through social media as a reward for focusing.
Yeah.
But the sources explicitly call this out as a complete failure of the technique. Doing that totally defeats the purpose because I'm not actually resting my brain.
You are doing the exact opposite. Scrolling social media, reading the news, or even answering text messages is not rest for the brain. It is simply swapping one demanding cognitive task for another.
Because the visual cortex is still firing.
Right.
The dopamine receptors are still being stimulated.
Exactly. Your nervous system doesn't get a chance to settle at all. The research touches on something called attention restoration theory.
Okay, what's that?
It argues that directed attention, which is the intense focus you use to read a spreadsheet or write an email, that requires your brain to actively suppress external distractions. And that suppression is exhausting.
So it's the actual effort of ignoring everything else that tires us out.
Yes. So
Yeah.
true rest requires stepping into an environment of soft fascination.
Soft fascination, that sounds nice. What does that look like?
This means stepping away from the screen entirely. It's standing up, stretching, getting a glass of water, or simply looking out a window.
Right?
The sources note that even a brief connection with nature, just looking at a tree or watching the clouds, occupies the mind just enough to prevent boredom, but it requires zero active suppression of distractions.
Wow.
So your directed attention network finally gets to recharge.
That makes the biological mechanism so much clearer. Okay, so mistake number 2 that people make is attempting to multitask during the 25-minute focus session.
Oh, multitasking.
We touched on this, but the science behind it is fascinating. You cannot write a complex report and keep an eye on your incoming emails at the same time.
No, the human brain is neurologically incapable of true multitasking when it comes to high-level cognitive work.
So what are we doing when we think we're multitasking?
What you are actually doing is rapid context switching.
And every time you switch, there's a penalty.
A massive penalty. Every time you glance at an email while trying to write that report, your brain leaves a residue of attention on the email.
A residue.
Yeah. It takes significant time and metabolic energy to shift your focus back to the report. By the time you get back into the flow of the writing, your cognitive capacity is literally reduced.
Wow.
The 25 minutes only works if it is an uncontaminated block of focus.
Which leads to mistake number 3, being far too rigid with the methodology.
Yes, this is a big one.
People treat the 25-minute rule like an unbreakable law rather than a flexible framework.
The 25-minute block is a starting point, not a cage. If you are doing deep, complex coding or intense academic research, and say, a 45-minute focus session with a 10-minute break maps more naturally to your personal ultradian rhythm, you should adapt it.
That makes sense.
The goal is the rhythm of effort and recovery, not a strict adherence to a clock.
And if you have a day where you get interrupted by life, your kid needs you, a coworker drops by your desk, an urgent phone call happens, you haven't failed the system.
Not at all.
You just handle the interruption and start a new Pomodoro when you can.
Exactly. The sources also strongly warn against the modern trap of productivity comparison.
Oh, social media strikes again.
Yes. We constantly see people online posting their perfectly color-coded daily planners, bragging that they completed 12 Pomodoros before noon.
Right, the hustle bragging.
Comparing your daily rhythm to someone else's highly curated online persona is a fast track to misery.
So true.
Everyone's metabolic energy levels, their neurobiology, their personal responsibilities, they are vastly different.
Right. So when we avoid those common pitfalls, when we stop looking at screens during breaks, when we fiercely protect our attention from context switching, and when we embrace the flexibility to fit our own rhythms, the sources explain that a profound psychological shift occurs.
It really does.
The Pomodoro Technique stops being this strict, rigid discipline that you have to force yourself to do. It transforms into an effortless habit.
Because in human neurobiology, consistency always wins over intensity.
Consistency over intensity. I love that.
Doing a little bit every single day, even if it is just 2 highly focused 25-minute sessions, yields vastly superior long-term results than pulling a frantic, exhausting 6-hour marathon once a month.
But here's where it gets really interesting, though. The sources talk about classical conditioning.
Yes, Pavlov.
Right, I know that refers to Pavlov's dog salivating when he hear a bell.
Yeah.
But how does classical conditioning apply to a tomato timer on my desk?
Through simple repetition, the physical act of setting the timer becomes a powerful psychological trigger.
Okay, how so?
Over time, as you consistently pair the physical action of turning the dial or starting the app with the state of deep focus, your brain begins to recognize the pattern.
Oh, wow.
Eventually, the moment you set that timer, your brain automatically shifts gears. It says, the timer is running. This is the biological pathway we use for focus.
It essentially lowers the friction of starting.
Drastically. It eliminates what psychologists call decision fatigue.
Right, because you don't have to decide to work anymore.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You no longer have to exert massive amounts of willpower to convince yourself to work. You just have to exert enough willpower to start the timer.
And then the habit pathways in the brain take over the heavy lifting.
Yes.
That feels like the holy grail of working. It creates the ideal neurological conditions for the flow state. That elusive feeling where the rest of the world fades away, you're completely absorbed in the challenge, and time seems to pass effortlessly.
That's the dream.
You aren't forcing the focus. You have just removed the obstacles preventing it.
And that flow state is exactly what we are all chasing. But it's important to remember that progress is rarely a straight line.
Very true.
If you get distracted or if you miss a session, you haven't ruined the day. The framework teaches you that every single Pomodoro is a completely fresh beginning.
A clean slate.
It is a new opportunity to reset your attention and try again without carrying the guilt of the last distraction. It shifts your entire mindset around what it means to be productive.
Yeah.
It is no longer a frantic, anxiety-driven race to squeeze every last drop of output from your brain before you collapse.
It becomes a way of living and working with actual intention. We started this deep dive talking about the sheer frustration of sitting down to work and immediately losing an hour to the endless scroll of
Which
distractions.
is so common.
We've looked at Francisco Cereal's humble 1980s tomato timer. We've explored the neuroscience of our brain's natural wave-like rhythms and the default mode network.
Right.
We've discussed the absolute biological necessity of resting to avoid burnout and how to mold this framework to fit a real, unpredictable life.
And the overarching theme across all of this source material, I mean, from the psychological behavioral tricks to the deep neuroscience of attention, is a fundamental redefinition of success.
True productivity is not measured by how utterly exhausted you feel at the end of the day.
No, it's not.
It's not measured by how busy you look to your boss or how fast you respond to an email on a Sunday. True productivity is measured by making meaningful progress on the deep work that actually matters, while finishing the day with enough baseline energy left over for the people you love, for your hobbies, and for your own health.
I would strongly encourage you to take that specific point to heart. Taking care of yourself, taking those 5-minute breaks to step away from the glowing rectangles and just look at a tree or stare at the ceiling isn't something separate from doing good work.
It's not slacking off.
Exactly. It isn't a distraction from your larger goals. It is the very physiological foundation that makes good work possible in the first place.
Wow.
Without the rest, the machine breaks down. Rest is not a reward for the work. Rest is part of the work.
So what does this all mean? We know now that human attention is a biological wave, not a mechanical switch.
Right.
We know that relentless digital stimulation and constant context switching is actively burning out our neural pathways. And we know that our brains are actually doing some of their most brilliant, creative, dot-connecting work when we finally step away from the screen and allow the default mode network to process the world.
The background processing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'll leave you with this. If our brains naturally process information, solve complex problems, and make unexpected connections during those quiet 5-minute breaks, what massive, stubborn problems in your life might you finally solve today simply by allowing yourself the time to do absolutely nothing?